Welcome to everyone to tonight's talk by Professor Michael Gordin. My name is Ayako Kano. I'm the director of the Wolf Humanities Center, and it's in my role I would like to thank the co-sponsors of this keynote talk, as well as the conference that will be going on all day tomorrow, Edges of Truth, Secrecy, Afterlife, and the Limits of, Artifice and the Limits of Knowledge. We'd like to thank the Departments of English, History and Sociology of Science, East Asian Languages and Civilizations, the Center for East Asian Studies, the Program in Global, Medieval, and Renaissance Studies, and the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies for their generous support. I get to introduce Dr. Julia Verkolantsev, who will introduce our speaker in our little kabuki-esque sequence of entrance ceremonies. Dr. Julia Verkolantsev is Associate Professor of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and is this year's topic director for the Humanities Center. She is the founder of the Program in Global, Medieval, and Renaissance Studies and a specialist in medieval and early modern cultural and intellectual history of Central and Eastern Europe. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Verkolantsev.
Thank you, Ayako. I'm very happy to see the courageous crowd who struggled through the apocalyptic weather. So I'm very happy to be able to open the year of programming at the Wolf Humanities Center, which is devoted to the topic of truth. So this is our first public-facing event, and I am also honored to introduce our keynote speaker, who also opens not just the annual programming, but also the conference the sessions of which will happen tomorrow in Kislak Center. Professor Michael Gordin is a historian of science, intellectual culture, and politics, whose work spans Russia, Europe, the United States, and the global stage. He is Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History and Dean of the College at Princeton University. We're especially happy to welcome him back because he is a repeated offender and repeated guest at Penn, and already, what? Is it okay now? Has already talked, and in fact his previous talk also had something to do with artificiality, because his talk was on artificial languages in 2012. Professor Gordin has published widely monographs, edited volumes, and articles on themes ranging from the rise of science in Russia to the international politics of nuclear weapons and biological warfare, to the thorny boundaries between science and pseudoscience. I can only highlight a few examples here. His first book, A Well-Ordered Thing, Dmitry Mendeleev and the Shadow of the Periodic Table, offered a biography and a cultural history of Dmitry Mendeleev, showing the famous chemist not only as the architect of the periodic table of the elements, but also as a daring political and cultural figure. He then went on to write several books on the history of nuclear warfare, including a study of the atomic bombings of Japan, 5 Days in August, How World War II Became a Nuclear War, and Real Cloud at Dawn, Truman, Stalin, and the End of the Atomic Monopoly, an international history of nuclear intelligence. His further work on Cold War nuclear tensions includes the co-authored How Reason Almost Lost Its Mind, The Strange Career of Cold War Rationality, which traces how institutions and thinkers redefined rationality, reshaping the human sciences and decision-making in an age overshadowed by nuclear confrontation. In Scientific Babble, How Science Was Done Before and After Global English, he turned to the history of science through the languages in which it has been conducted. He has also written extensively on Albert Einstein, from a monograph, Einstein in Bohemia, which follows the intertwined paths of Albert Einstein in the city of Prague, where he briefly taught across the 20th century, to his most recent book, Free Creations of the Human Mind, The Worlds of Albert Einstein, co-authored with Diana Kormos-Buchwald. Closely tied to today's lecture is his exploration of fringe science and pseudoscience. In the Pseudoscience Wars, Immanuel Velikovsky and the Birth of the Modern Fringe, he traces the remarkable career of the Russian-American psychoanalyst and alternative historian Velikovsky. His book On the Fringe, Where Science Meets Pseudoscience, employs the history and philosophy of pseudoscience to expose the boundaries by which modern science defines itself. Most recently, this work has reached an even wider audience in the Oxford Very Short Introduction series under the title Pseudoscience. I have to leave out many of his works, otherwise we'll never get to his lecture. But I should note that beyond his scholarship, Professor Gordin has given much service to his institution. He was the inaugural director of the FUN Global Fellows Program in 2013-2014, and from 2017 to 2023 served as director of the Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts before becoming dean of the college. His honors include fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Guggenheim Foundation, and in 2009 he was elected to the Leopoldina, the National Academy of Sciences of Germany. Professor Gordin is currently working on a history of how the collapse of the Soviet Union reshaped science inside and outside Russia and Ukraine. But today he turns to another of his favorite themes in a lecture entitled The Wretched Subjects.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I want to congratulate all of you brave souls for making it through the rain here. The people online, you're also welcome, but less brave. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be kicking off what looks to be a fascinating conference. My topic today is distasteful, rejected, marginalized, or demonized knowledge. These are the wretched subjects of the title. I'm going to focus on the natural sciences here. The points are generalizable to the humanities and the social sciences and many other kinds of knowledge on the one hand, and on medicine to the other, and other people can explore those themes. I'm going to concentrate on the natural sciences, not only because that's what I happen to work on and be interested in, but because I think the questions are simpler when you focus on the sciences, because they raise epistemic questions in an especially crisp way, which is much murkier when you enter humanistic realms. But I don't just want to talk about wretched subjects, I also want to talk about their persistence. So my talk today will start with a defense of why people should study these topics that may not be necessary in the room here, but is probably useful to go over, and the long history of rejecting those studies while simultaneously studying them. And this is basically an act of preterition, an act of claiming you're not going to talk about topic X, and by the act of saying that, you're talking about topic X. So that's a historiographical scholarly point. And then there is the persistence of the fringe itself, why it seems to be, and I would argue is, ineradicable, like it's just always there. I'm going to make the claim that the fringe, and for reasons I'll get to, I don't care for the term pseudoscience, that is in fact ineradicable. It's always going to be there, and even if it were possible to eradicate it, it may not be desirable to do so. This is time for me to check. Can everybody hear me fine? Excellent. All right. First, I want to explain the title, The Persistence of Wretched Subjects. This is an extremely nerdy scholarly reference. It's a quotation from a 75-year-old one-page scholarly critique of a book review, which is what that is. It's just pretty in the weeds. As you can see on the top there in the left, in 1951, Otto Neugebauer wrote this piece in ISIS, which is the main flagship journal of the History of Science Society, critiquing a comment in a bibliography prepared by the Society's founder and the journal's editor, George Sarton. The issue concerned whether Drower's edition of the Mandean Book of the Zodiac was indeed what Sarton called it, a, quote, wretched collection of miscellaneous nonsense. There is, as always, a backstory to these kinds of academic quibbles. Sarton was a Belgian emigre, trained as a chemist who later became a historian. He fled his homeland in 1915 because of the German invasion and eventually washed up at Widener Library at Harvard, where he founded the first History of Science program in the United States, as well as the History of Science Society and its journal ISIS. He was a specialist on medieval Arabic contributions to knowledge and also extremely partial to Auguste Comte's positivism. He was idiosyncratic. There are some similarities for Neugebauer. He was trained in the sciences and also fled Europe because of German aggression, but the timing and the expertise are everything. He was born in Innsbruck, Austria, and studied mathematics with the greats at Göttingen in the 1920s. In 1924, he went to Copenhagen for a year where he began to focus on Egyptian mathematics. He also founded a journal. The German title is the Central Journal for Mathematics and its edge areas, Grenzgebiete. So the fringe was there as well. He founded that in 1931 and then had to flee after Hitler came to power in 1933. First went to Copenhagen and eventually ended up at Brown, which is where he was when he wrote The Study of Wretched Subjects. In 1984, he joined the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He was an extremely technical historian of mathematics and astronomy, and he used ancient books like this all the time. It's worth noting that Neugebauer agreed that the subjects are wretched and nonsense. He just thought that it was an incomplete description. They are nonsense, but still valuable and worth studying. And he goes on into a brief defense of why it should be discussed. This brings to mind this quotation attributed to Saul Lieberman, professor of the Talmud at the Jewish Theological Seminary for many years. Nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense is a very important science. The religious reference helps situate my and others' fundamental approach to these kinds of questions. The history of early Christianity is, I think, a good analog of how to talk about fringe sciences. This, as some of you may recognize, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It is a church inside of a very, very big church in Jerusalem. And it is said to be the site where Jesus Christ rose from the dead. But I'm not showing it for that reason. I want to make a point about an analogy between the history of religions and the history of science. These are the canonical Gospels, as I'm sure you all know. This is just a sampling of the non-canonical Gnostic Gospels. There is a simple term for these throughout most of Christian history. These white ones are heresy. That's the word for them. But of course, that's not what the people who actually wrote and believed in the Gospels thought they were. They thought they were documents in their true religion, just like the ones in yellow were. They thought that they were Christians, not schismatics. One of the great innovations in the historiography of Christianity over the past several decades is to take these Gospels seriously as part of the construction of Christian doctrine. We learn more about how the church actually evolved by examining the things that the church considered deeply wrong. My view, like Neugebauer's and like Lieberman's, is that this is a better approach to the history of science, to spend time with the wretched subjects in order to understand what the main story, or what you think the main story is, and you'll probably change your view of the canonical Gospels if you do that. I think this because in a very real sense, there's no way to do the history of science without talking about this material. And not just talking about it, but making it integral to how we think about real science, however you might define that. So I'm going to continue with the theme of antiquity. This bust isn't really a bust of a person. I mean, it is a bust of a person, but it's a bust of Hippocrates. But there's two things about Hippocrates. One, we have no idea what Hippocrates looked like at all. So this is just a construction that somebody thought would look like somebody who was Hippocrates. But perhaps more importantly, the writings attributed to Hippocrates are not by one person. It is very, very clear that they are a compilation of multiple texts by multiple people written over a long period of time, supplemented and redacted over the years. But what's significant for our purposes is that these are some of the earliest surviving natural scientific documents in the Western tradition. and they're shot through with demarcation work. This is a passage from On the Sacred Disease. It's the second paragraph of it. The sacred disease is what we would now call epilepsy. It is my opinion that those who first called this disease sacred were the sort of people we now call witch doctors, faith healers, quacks, and charlatans. These are exactly the people who pretend to be very pious and to be particularly wise. By invoking a divine element, they were able to screen their own failure to give suitable treatment to, and so called this a sacred malady to conceal ignorance of their nature, of its nature. So the text as a whole is a diagnosis of what we now call epilepsy, and he has two main arguments. People who recall this text, if they recall this text, usually remember this argument, the first one, which is an argument against mythology and quacks. In other words, the second argument is that epilepsy is actually caused by the wind when it blows in different directions. So, in other words, we're pretty sure that his actual argument, his affirmative argument, is incorrect. That's just an aside, though. The point is the demarcation effort is the thing that sticks, and in our earliest texts, we find these kinds of demonizations of something that is not to be seen as science. In every natural scientific text, there is implicitly or often explicitly a fringe or a counter science as part of making valid the scientific claim that's in the original text. Part of making claims about the natural world, making them verifiable and giving them verisimilitude, is to detract from competitors. A good example in the medieval period is atomism, which is whenever it is invoked as a nonsense theory that is absolutely not how matter is structured. That's the only reason it ever comes up. It is now happens to be a theory that we think is largely correct, but that is not at all its function for most of recorded history. And it's intriguing in this case that the debunked theory is the one that we now like. So does this persistent debunking hold true from antiquity to medieval to modernity? I think it holds true even more. In the interest of being extra nerdy, I'm going to quote the Oxford English Dictionary. This is the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of pseudoscience, which I am including to raise 2 points. The first is that, according to this definition, it is not the case that we have a continuum from really good science to mediocre science, which by definition is most science, that's what mediocre means, to poor science, to really bad science, and then pseudoscience at the far end of the curriculum, the continuum. This seems to say that it's a mistake to think that. Pseudoscience isn't even part of that continuum, it's something else utterly. The second point I want to make with this definition is that the dates of when the term enters the English language. This is why the OED is so helpful. It's introduced at the very end of the 18th century, very beginning of the 19th century. The term scientist is coined in 1831, also in a book review, actually. The invention of the two concepts, science and pseudoscience, organized scientist and demonized pseudoscientist come together. They're invented at the same time. Until you have a notion of what science is in a kind of, as a profession or a legitimized body of knowledge, there's no reason to have a counterpart that is its opposite. And indeed, that's what we saw with Hippocrates. It's when he wants to make a case for an established medicine that he has to invent a counter medicine to be debunked. He could have used the word pseudo because it's Greek, but that's not what he used. So now that I've raised pseudoscience, it's probably a good idea for me to address the fact that many people I talk to about this question think there is an easy way to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. And that answer, the way you do that is through the philosophy of science, and specifically through a very particular philosopher of science. The term demarcation is Sir Karl Popper's term for how to separate science off from pseudoscience. I often get Popper's criterion quoted at me, usually by undergraduates. This is what it is. The criterion of the scientific status of a theory is its falsifiability. Popper was extremely impressed with Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity and its spectacular confirmation in an eclipse expedition in 1919. He came up with this criterion as a way of explaining why he was so impressed with that idea, and he designed this criterion to both valorize the Einsteinian view of nature and to marginalize out Marx and Freud. He came up with this notion in 1919, but he coined the term demarcation problem in 1928 or 29 and unveiled the whole thing publicly in a lecture in the United Kingdom at Peterhouse in Cambridge in 1953. This is in biology textbooks throughout the United States for very peculiar historical reasons. But there are three problems with it, which I think are important. The first is, how would you know that you have falsified a theory? You do an experiment to try and debunk someone's theory, and you don't get the same result they got. Are you done? If that were the case, then all of established science would have been debunked by middle school kids trying to replicate standard experiments and failing to do so on a regular basis. Like, it's clearly not enough to just not get the right answer, because maybe your instrument is wrong. Maybe you didn't do the experiment the right way. It's just not clean the way Popper presents it. The second problem is, does it demarcate properly? Does it cut the sciences in the right places? What you want a criterion to do is to include everything that you think is a science and exclude everything that you think shouldn't be a science. The problem with this criterion is that it works very well for things like molecular biology, where you have a lab-based science where you find individual facts and you work on them. It doesn't work as well for the more historical sciences like cosmology or evolutionary biology or geology, where you can't run the tape again. So you have to just make inferences from the data we now have. It's harder to make a purely falsifiable claim. You use different kinds of reasoning in those contexts. So it ends up fringing out stuff that you don't want to fringe out. On the other hand, creationism, ufology, and parapsychology make falsifiable claims all the time. They've read Popper too. They make very structured claims saying, if you do this experiment and get this result, then I'm wrong. And then they argue with you that you didn't do the experiment right, which is the first point. There's a third technical problem with Popper, which is that he doesn't think truth exists. His argument is that those things that we consider to be true are just those things which are not yet false. And so we are constantly on the edge of proving things false forever. This is actually can be a very compelling way of thinking, but I don't think it captures what most scientists think they do in the lab every day. It's just not, I think, a persuasive criterion. Larry Loudon, another philosopher of science, just working through many critiques of this, pointed out that there's no reason we should expect a bright line of demarcation because the sciences are heterogeneous. So why would you expect there to be a simple way of doing it? And philosophers since have worked trying to figure out other ways we might possibly try to decide which wretched subjects are in and which nice subjects are out of the category of pseudoscience, and they've come up with two-dimensional ones. This is, I think, interesting. There's lots of problems with it, but it's from Massimo Pigliucci. I don't want to endorse this, but I do want to say it's at least an interesting attempt to get a little forward. The key point I want to take away is that we define a bunch of things to be pseudosciences as a culture, and there's a lot of continuity, and you can see it on this graph, with a lot of things that we think are plausible. And that continuity is, I think, not an accident, but an intrinsic part of what the fringe is. So the persistence of the problem of demarcation within science raises the question of how historians can and should talk about it. For a long time, the official position was that it was denigrated. That's what we saw with Neugebauer's response to Sarton. The fact that Neugebauer was able to publish his critique of Sarton in the journal edited by the guy he was critiquing tells you that it's not that denigrated, right? Like it was actually a public conversation in some form. But the perception among historians of science was, despite there being a large and constant literature on fringe topics, that working on this is not a great thing to be doing for your career and not a wonderful way of establishing yourself as a historian. You should work on real science. I was told this when I was in graduate school. I think Professor Hayton was probably told this when he was in graduate school. He works on astrology. This is the usual story of how the history of science was done for centuries until the 1970s, when something interesting happened. What changed is the expansion of the sociology of scientific knowledge as a framework, as indicated by this rush of books. These are all 70s books, even though Kuhn was written in the 60s. It was reissued in 1970. Kuhn did not think he was an SSK person, but he was appropriated very avidly by that group, and he falls in the bunch. And Collins looks like he's from 85, but it's a bunch of articles from the 70s that are repackaged. So these are all 70s books. The basic postulate of the sociology of scientific knowledge is that we need to treat correct and incorrect knowledge in exactly the same way. If in the age of Neugebauer and Sarton it was typical to treat correct science, at least correct at the time it was done, using philosophy of science, and incorrect science using sociology of science. Instead, we should use the same explanations in every case. Most of the early SSK people attempt to use sociology of science to try and talk about correct knowledge, to try and show that all knowledge is social in some way or the other. But there was a flip side where they also suggest approaching fringe knowledge claims, phrenology, parapsychology, witchcraft, as philosophically coherent knowledge systems. As a result, there was a flourishing in the 1970s of SSK-induced studies of the fringe. It's a very rich body of literature, and it bears rereading. I return to it over and over again. It's a wonderful way of thinking through how to talk about wretched subjects. At that moment, studying the fringe was not seen as déclassé or disreputable. It was at the forefront of a dynamic approach to understanding knowledge symmetrically. And a little over a decade ago, the situation changes back to a bias against studying these topics. The irony is that the publication of this book in 1985, which elevated the importance of thinking symmetrically, and every historian of science has read this book, it said you should think about correct and incorrect knowledge claims symmetrically, and it makes that strong argument. It injects SSK into the mainstream of methodologies of science, and you start to get people using it to talk about Galileo or particle physics or embryology. In short, you could do all the fun things that SSK did, talking about real science, and leave the wretched subjects aside. And so they got marginalized again. Or so it would seem. So when I contacted Oxford University Press about writing this book, Pseudoscience, A Very Short Introduction, I had to make a case for it. They said there's no reason anybody would want to read a book about this topic. Nobody studies this stuff. There's no classroom where this would be taught. What's the point? Was it worthy of being in the Very Short Introduction series? Was there enough to even talk about? It's worth noting that they had already commissioned a book on alchemy, so it's not like they thought that none of these topics were interesting, but they didn't think the category made any sense. Eventually, they were persuaded. As you can see, I was not alone. This is just stuff from the last 5 years that are on topics that are classically on the fringe or considered pseudoscientific. I didn't cause this, right? This has always been true. People have always been working on this kind of stuff. It's just not talked about openly as a major research strain in the history of science, which it has always been, but it's always been somewhat in the background. The visibility of it, however, has become much higher over the last 5 years, literally exactly 5 years, for reasons that I think you can probably imagine. This is setting aside the fact that there's a whole other body of literature about misinformation and disinformation that has been floating around the discourse. I'm also not citing anything here that's specifically exactly about the pandemic. There's a book about vaccine hesitancy right behind my head, but that actually came out before COVID. It's about mumps, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. The history of the fringe, though, today is no longer fringe. But this is masking a more basic point. The history of the fringe is rich because the fringe itself is so persistent you can always find it. There's always something you can work on. But why is that the case? So I'm going to explain this point about the inevitability of the fringe in a little more depth using a very tinker-toy model, so please be forgiving of its simplicity. So when most people think of science or knowledge, they imagine this magenta entity here, which is what I'm going to call the orthodox consensus. It's the set of things you find in textbooks or that the vast majority of the relevant scientific community believes. So believing all of this stuff isn't required to be a scientist. In fact, you couldn't have any science if you didn't argue with some parts that were in this. But if you didn't believe most of it, you would have a very hard time engaging in conversation with any scientist. It's basic, it's the rules of the game that you're supposed to be playing with. It's very hard to function as a member of the scientific community without being part of it. Its border, though, is fuzzy, because we actually don't have certainty about our knowledge, and notions are always entering or leaving the orthodox consensus. That's why science still exists, right? We're still learning new things and rejecting things that we thought were true but realize were mistaken. So it's a historically constituted consensus at any particular point in time in any particular field, always fluctuating. And then you have a fringe. It is some distance away from the consensus, and its edges are even blurrier than the magenta entity. Although it's even more reductive to think about this in 2 dimensions, you could say that heterodoxy sort of increases with distance. The further away you are from the consensus, the fringier you are. There are plenty of ideas that are weird and not consensus yet, but that live in between. So in the 70s and early 1980s, string theory was definitely a fringy idea within physics, and then it becomes quite core by the early 90s, and then it moves around quite a bit. Dark matter theories were originally quite fringy, now are a major research area in physics. It wasn't, string theory and dark matter were never all the way out at the edge. What's all the way out at the edge? Stuff like this. It's a very heterogeneous place, the edge. There are a lot of theories at this nebulous border, and they're not equally distant from the core. But you do get groupings of things on the fringe, that is, theories that are closer together with each other, and it's a historically mutating entity. So this is highly schematic, but I think it helps us understand something of the way fringe theories work and how there's a continuity between orthodox science and the fringe. There's an interaction across these blurry boundaries, but there's some stuff that's so blurry, like, let's say, I think we can now say Bigfoot is probably there. That's like way out there that is very hard to bring in. To illustrate this, I'm going to briefly introduce some of the categories I use in pseudoscience, the very short introduction, to group together some subsets of stuff on the fringe. If we can't demarcate them rigorously philosophically, and they all don't behave the same way, there's still ways we can talk about them as having useful family resemblances, subsets of them, in order to get better purchase. So I'm going to briefly go through those. The first category, and I think in many ways is the most important, are the vestigial sciences. These are things that were at one time a science, but are no longer considered to be a science. Almost everything that's on the fringe was at one point considered to be scientific claim of some kind or other, and then eventually got fringed out. Astrology in the Renaissance is, as people in this room can definitely tell you, the most prestigious, most mathematical, most evidence and data-heavy science. It was used to make predictions about the future, in many ways similar to economics today. Just leave that there. This is not the astrology you see in newspaper columns. That in itself is a fad that started in the 1930s. This is a highly mathematically sophisticated enterprise. And some of it is not wrong in our terms. Celestial entities affect stuff on Earth. The moon affects the tides, the sun affects the seasons. This is a generalization from those basic observations to say other things happen as well. But it does drop out, depending how you measure it, 17th century, 18th century. And to advocate it today is definitely not an orthodox position, although there are vibrant astrological traditions in almost every culture on the globe. Alchemy is very similar. In the 17th century, largely indistinguishable from chemistry. The terms are used interchangeably. But by the mid-18th century, people who call themselves chemists use the term alchemy to describe a very specific set of doctrines that they want to differentiate themselves from. It's a tool for making themselves a profession. Another more recent example is eugenics. The term eugenics is older than the term eugenics by about 2 decades. This is the theory that you attempt to shape human heredity through a variety of engineering means, sterilization, subsidizing healthy people that you want to have more babies, blood tests to prevent people who might be related from marrying each other, etc. This precedes human genetics as a science, and in the first 20 years or so, very hard to differentiate who was a eugenicist and who was a geneticist, because most people thought they were the same thing. There are a couple of geneticists who do not think that they're doing eugenics, but it's a very small minority until the 1920s, when you start to get both internal and internal reasons within the science itself, that is, within genetics, and external reasons due to political pressures like the rise of Nazism that make it discredited. It took time and effort for practitioners to separate these vestigial sciences from what they understood to be proper science. And thereby making a pseudoscience counterpart to the thing they wanted to advocate. This is an extremely broad category. Really, many of the fringe doctrines that circulate today, when you dig into their history, turn out to have at one point been considered a legitimate knowledge claim. And in this, we see a parallelism with science itself, which grows out of its own past, right? It's a process of critiquing what is current day knowledge and trying to do better than that. So that's one category. Then there's doctrines that are hyper-politicized by political regimes in order to advocate for a science that's very similar to an ideology. These are often what people have in mind when they think of pseudosciences, especially the attempt to argue that there was a specific Aryan physics that was distinct from the Jewish physics of quantum mechanics or relativity theory that was promulgated in the early 1930s in Germany. It is noteworthy that this does not succeed. The Nazi state tamps this thing down, but it is an attempt to try and create a hyper-politicized science, or the attacks against Mendelian genetics in the Soviet Union. From 1948 to 1965, genetics is illegal in the Soviet Union, considered to be a bourgeois pseudoscience, and some kind of inheritance of acquired characteristics is considered standard theory. These are very well-publicized theories. They're also extremely rare because you need a large apparatus of money, political power, and organizational capacity in order to promulgate this kind of thing and enforce the orthodoxy. They're pretty rare. Racial science in the 19th century US, especially in the South, has characteristics that are elements of that. They don't just happen in autocracies. They can also happen in democratic polities, but they are, I think, fairly exceptional, but they're quite interesting. A third category is what I call counter-establishment sciences, and this is what most people think of when they think of pseudoscience. This is stuff like creationism, ufology, cryptozoology, which is Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Jersey Devil, Chupacabra, all that stuff, and cosmic catastrophism. These movements basically are almost all American-inflected in some way, and they fall into the post-World War II period. That's where they started. They still exist. Basically, they're aggressively attacked by mainstream scientists, and in response, what these people do is not fold, but instead construct a counter-establishment with its own peer-reviewed journals, its own degree programs, their own conferences, and they do everything that looks like science and just say, we're doing a different science from what you guys are doing. You do your thing, we do our thing, we're just a separate kind of science. The mimesis between science and the fringe here is extremely strong. There's very little way to tell the difference between looking at a journal of creation science and looking at a journal of geology. They look very, very similar to the untrained eye. I want to flag cosmic catastrophism because it's going to come back later. I wrote a book about this a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago now. This case is going to return in a few minutes, so don't worry if you have no idea who Immanuel Velikovsky is. Trust me, you're going to want to know. Just a few minutes. The fourth category is one of the most dynamic and vibrant areas of the fringe. This is alternative theories of mind, the powers of mind beyond the five traditional senses, whether this is understood as animal magnetism, the soul. There are 3 points of note here. This is perhaps the most dominant area of the fringe in at least the modern period. There's very great interest in theories like telepathy and psychokinesis for a very long period of time. You have to take my word for it, but trust me, there's a lot of this stuff. The second is that it has a very interesting and long-lived genealogical relationship. So take mesmerism in Ancien Regime France right before the French Revolution. Both the practices of what they did and the people morph into the movement of spiritualism, which is actually created in upstate New York in around the 1840s, which is table rapping, seances, communication with spirits. There's very similar continuities, and there's direct continuities from the spiritualists to the people who study parapsychology in a lab using cards to study telepathy, most prominently at Duke in the 1930s through the 1970s. And then eventually spoon bending with Uri Geller in the 1970s. It's again continuous with the one before. I don't know, some people here will remember Uri Geller. If you don't, there's a scene in The Matrix where little kids are bending spoons with their minds. This is what it's about. It's a reference that's like lost on most people who watch The Matrix. So the third thing that's, I think, interesting about this is there's a number of important innovations in experimental practice are drawn from the engagement of establishment science with this particular fringe. So in efforts to debunk mesmerism, the commission led by Benjamin Franklin and Antoine Lavoisier invents the placebo sham, which is a standard part of behavioral psychology experiments and one of the first controlled experimental designs. Experimental design continues to advance. Randomized control trials are introduced into the sciences as an attempt to debunk telepathy. the origins of p-values, the 0.05 thing that is now standard in experiments, is developed in part as an attempt to make parapsychology experiments more rigorous by R.A. Fisher in the 1920s. There's a very long and interesting dialogue where engagement with the fringe, this particular fringe, makes behavioral science more rigorous. These categories, all of them, are mutually interpenetrating. Some of these are vestigial, some of these are hyperpoliticized, and they evolve over time. There's some degree of continuity, which is another important valence of persistence. A final instance of persistence I want to mention before concluding is a phenomenon I will call stacking. Stacking is a very familiar concept from the history of science, history of technology. And I'm going to illustrate it with this painting, which is American Progress by John Gast from 1872. Some of you may recognize this painting. It's a very familiar piece of Americana. And the part so Progress is walking along, and what she is doing is building railroad tracks and stringing telegraph cables right next to each other. So what happens first are the train tracks. You build trains first. And then you have to string telegraph cables. And to do that, it would be good if you didn't have a lot of trees, and if it was relatively straight, and if you actually owned the right of way. And it turns out the train has already done that. So you string the telegraph cable right over the train tracks, and those things stack on top of each other. If you wanted to know where the internet cables across the US are buried, you will not be surprised to learn that they are buried in the same place. Like the train tracks, the electricity grid, the telegraph cables, telephone lines, and the internet are all stacked on top of each other. This painting also has like this deeply racist thing happening where the Native Americans are being expelled by Progress as you move across the plains. I don't want to not mention that that's part of what this picture is about. So you see something similar about stacking going on in fringe theories. And I'm going to illustrate this by turning to the followers of Immanuel Velikovsky's theories of cosmic catastrophism. So I'm going to very briefly outline what those theories are so that the surprising nature of the stacking becomes more visible. So Velikovsky was born in Vitebsk, which is now in Belarus, but was then part of the Russian Empire. He had a very tumultuous youth. He moved around Russia, Germany, France, Scotland, and Austria, and he ended up in Tel Aviv in the 1930s and worked managing his parents' real estate investments, and also trained as a psychiatrist. In 1939, he moved with his wife and 2 daughters to New York City to pursue an idea for a book. So he went on sabbatical. He basically arrived at the port of New York right before Poland was invaded, so he stayed. And the idea for a book was a refutation of Sigmund Freud's Moses and Monotheism, which was published that same year. Freud's argument is very complicated, but suffice it to say that Velikovsky was enraged by the argument, which was that Moses was an Egyptian, not an Israelite, and that the religion emerged out of guilt of the Israelites murdering Moses, the father figure. And so the entire thing is an Israelite corruption of an Egyptian religion suffused with Oedipal guilt. So that's what Velikovsky's really pissed off about, and he decides he's going to write a book to refute that. But while doing his research, he moves in a very different direction while in the United States, and it ends up changing his whole life. He eventually settled in Princeton, New Jersey, right near the campus. So what is the idea? Velikovsky was struck by the fact that several of the Exodus stories look like natural disasters, such as the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, which he understood not as a miracle, but as a fact that the axis of the earth shifts, and so the water drains out of the basins near the equator. It's a geological event. The sun standing over the plains of Gibeon and Joshua, which he attributes as a shift in the earth's axis. This was stimulated by reading a theory about Mount Sinai being an active volcano, which got him thinking that maybe these events were all natural. And then he found a translation of an edition of an Egyptian document called the Papyrus Ipuwer, which he saw as an Egyptian rendering of the 10 plagues. So he thought he could now coordinate that these were natural disasters that were attested in multiple different traditions, and confirmed his belief that these are real things that are happening, not symbolic ones, but also that they're not theological, they are natural. He compares other myths like Chinese dragons in the sky, Vedic chariots, Greek myths like Athena bursting out of the head of Zeus, and also some ancient astronomy. So what could be the event So what could this event be that caused so many disasters on a global scale, witnessed by early humanity, ancient humanity, events so terrifying that people had to suppress them in a psychoanalytic way to try and mask how awful they actually were and encode them in the mythological and symbolic heritage of world culture. So he said it had to be a planetary phenomenon, or something even bigger than planetary, because everybody saw it. He was convinced that documents show that the solar system had been arranged something around 1500 BCE in full view of the eyes of humanity. So what happens is a comet is shot out, probably from Jupiter, and approaches Earth. It's not, despite the name of his book, Worlds in Collision, a collision like this. This is not what he has in mind. It's more like this. You end up with that comet being caught in electromagnetic and gravitational interaction with Earth, causing it to tilt its axis and move around a lot, which causes all of those disruptions. And also, it's terrifyingly close in the sky, so it actually freaks everybody out, quite understandably. And then the comet settles down to become Venus, Earth's nearest planetary neighbor. So there's also a Mars story, which I'm leaving out for the sake of time. Anyway, that's the book. That's the story. It's published in this book, Worlds in Collision, which is a gripping read. It comes out in 1950. It does extremely well. There's a lot of controversy around the publication of the book, which I chronicle in the Pseudoscience Wars, and it's not relevant for now. What matters is that he put forth the argument based on ancient texts and some scientific documents, and then he built up a whole array of other books which argue for his redating of ancient history so as to make the astronomical argument work. This very imaginative reorientation of ancient history produces a plethora of fans, talks, courses on college campuses, heterodox journals, conferences, all the things that you think go on in a counter-establishment science. This is a coherent account of ancient history and of astronomy, and was decried by pseudoscience by scientists and humanists as soon as it appeared. So there's a persistence of wretched subjects in this whole story as well. But when I say fringe theories stack, I don't mean that these books stack on that book. I mean something more than that. These are all parts of the same theory. What I mean is something different that happens among Velikovsky's followers. There are two theories that I found repeatedly talking in his followers and reading in the literature. And there are very few of them left because it peters out in the end of the 70s, but there are still some. One is a belief that the JFK assassination is the result of a conspiracy. It's very, very common among Velikovskians. It's not so much a scientific theory, although the theory does involve some accounts of ballistics. But it is that the assassination in '63 is not the result of Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. Beyond that one point of agreement that he did not act alone, people who are interested in alternative theories of the JFK assassination do not agree on almost anything. There's a wide array of plausible explanations in that world, theories and sub-theories. It's a very small subculture, but it happens that quite a few cosmic catastrophists are in this subculture, as well as being in the Velikovsky subculture. There's no obvious connection between Oswald and Venus, and yet this is the case. The second theory is even more common, and I think kind of more intriguing. This is skepticism that the plays and poems conventionally attributed to William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon were not, in fact, written by him. Once again, what you get beyond the skepticism of the traditional account is a variety of possible authors. These are the top 4, but there are over 80 possible candidates. I'm not going to go into the evidence or arguments here about the potential veracity of these claims, but I want to note that this is a fringe theory, and the mainstream consensus does think that Shakespeare wrote his plays. Again, there's nothing of Velikovsky's theory of ancient history and the solar system that requires you to take any position about whether a particular actor named Shakespeare wrote or did not write any plays. Velikovsky himself noticed how many of his followers and acolytes were interested in this theory, and he doesn't take a position on it. He just observes it, and he's like, oh, that's odd that all of you are really interested in this. But the story gets a little stranger. This is Ignatius Donnelly. He's a Philadelphian. As you might be able to tell, he has a jaunty and outsized personality. He was born to Irish Catholic immigrants in this city, and he received a good education and started out as a lawyer. He entered the bar in 1855. He moved to the Minnesota Territory in 1857, fleeing rumors of financial scandal in Philadelphia and co-creating a utopian community there. Minnesota was very good for Donnelly. He was lieutenant governor of the state from 1860 to 1863. He was a radical Republican who served in Congress from 1863 to 1869. But it's not his political life that interests us. He published a number of books that sold quite well in his day. In 1882 and 1883, he published the books Atlantis and Ragnarok. The book Atlantis is what makes the Atlantis myth actually popular again, so that dates back to Donnelly. The books present a consistent argument, but it's the latter one, Ragnarok, that stands out for us. He reads ancient mythology, principally the Bible and Scandinavian myth, to argue that a comet hits Earth in antiquity and initiates a number of natural disasters, which are recorded in myth as well as in geology. It's not quite the same argument as Velikovsky, but it's really close. So much so that Velikovsky was accused of plagiarizing Donnelly. And much like Freud with Nietzsche, Velikovsky claims he never read Donnelly, so there's no way he could have plagiarized him. Interestingly, 5 years after Ragnarok, Donnelly publishes The Great Cryptogram, which is an analysis of Francis Bacon's writings and Shakespeare's plays, and argues that Francis Bacon actually encoded his authorship of Shakespeare's plays in the plays. Once again, you have cosmic catastrophism and Shakespearean skepticism coming together. In this instance, a century earlier than I found it. So these are fringe theories that stack. They're like sitting on top of each other. 2 points are worth noticing here. Once you believe one fringe theory, it seems to be much easier to believe several. Second, the stacking of fringe theories does not seem to be entirely random. Sometimes you see a connection due to ideological affinity, like several fringe theories that are associated with fundamentalist Christianity, for example. And other times you see patterns like Shakespeare and cosmic catastrophism that is repeated across centuries but without any obvious logic. So I'm going to offer possible explanation for both of those points, the one equals many and particular stackings. And to do so, I'm going to turn to the model of the center and the periphery from before and the work of Ludwig Fleck. So Fleck's philosophy and sociology of science, preceding SSK by decades, is very suggestive in precisely this sense. I'm not going to do full justice to the text here, but this quotation gives some guidance to his notion of thought collectives, characterized by certain thought styles, which give a social basis for scientific beliefs as well as beliefs in general. I'm not going to read the quotation, it's up there, but it points to how social structures of groups and the social nature of cognition within groups helps build a particular pattern which sustains what he calls a harmony of illusions, consistency within a framework, which is not to be understood as demonizing knowledge. It's just how knowledge works. Knowledge works through building harmonies of illusions within social circles. But it's also how thinking works on the fringe. Fleck doesn't make the extension, but here's how it might work. One thing that goes on when an individual encounters a fringe theory, that is a theory that's fairly far outside the orthodox consensus, is that individual experiences a strong degree of cognitive resistance. The new theory contradicts many things they've been taught, like that the earth is round, for example, and what other ideas they believe. So the person chooses to reject that standard view. They initially reject creationism or the UFOs or Bigfoot. But then once, for whatever reason, the first such fringe theory breaches these cognitive defenses, and it functions a bit like a catalyst. If you start to believe one fringe theory, you've already bucked the orthodox consensus once, and the heavens didn't break open, the earth didn't shatter, nothing happened, no one died, everything is totally fine. And you realize it's fine to believe this thing. It doesn't actually disrupt anything, except you feel more persuaded by this theory that other people think is not credible. So why not do it again? The resistance is much lower the second time you come across a theory that you find appealing, and then perhaps lower still in the future. My suggestion here is that rather than trying to focus heavily on the question of demarcation, is something a pseudoscience or isn't it, but instead focusing on explaining empirical phenomena that you can see on the fringe, like stacking, we might get to a richer cognitive picture of how logically unrelated theories can function together within an individual's reasoning. But why do things stack the way they seem to? I think that path dependence might be part of this. Path dependence is another history of technology idea, familiar from the QWERTY keyboard or the railroad gauge. Early decisions have a way of locking in particular choices. If you look ahistorically at fringe theories, there's like an infinity of choice among options and no reason why some stacking should happen more than others. But it's possible that past stackings create conditions for future ones. So in our case, while Velikovsky always denied reading Donnelly, many of his followers might have been curious, and they could have been exposed to the Shakespeare authorship alternatives through doing that. The harmony of Donnelly's thought collective with Velikovsky's allows for the transfer even across generations. So where does this leave us? And this is actually my last slide. If we shift our attention from and understand that fringe science is inevitable, that is, it's just part of the knowledge sphere that we work in, and that it's a product of processes of science functioning normally, then however much we dislike the fringe, we can't eradicate it. We can, however, recognize that not all these fringe doctrines are equally destructive to the public welfare, whether in terms of health or the environment. So we can concentrate debunking efforts on those where it's really important and not get distracted by those that are more or less harmless. In the end, I would say that pseudoscience, the category, it's science's shadow. The brighter the light shown on science, the sharper the shadow is. The outburst of this stuff in the last few decades is not a sign that science is weakening, but rather that science is extremely high prestige and that people want to be a part of that enterprise. The fringe thinks it's doing science. It doesn't think it's doing something pseudo. And so if we take that seriously, we get a different perception of what the status of science actually is. They think they're doing science, and so whatever scientists say science is, they also do in terms of form, even if they don't do it in terms of content. People on the fringe, for example, police their own fringes. The Velikovskians hated the creationists and vice versa. The key point of the shadow argument is that the action is not the shadow, it's the hand. So if you want to study how the fringe works, you should pay attention to the science, because that tells you much more about the dynamics of what's going on than the fringe does. It's more complicated and more interesting than the shadow. And I think our scholarship should reflect that. Thank you very much for your attention. I would love to hear your thoughts, but I don't know what happens. What does happen, Julia? There's a microphone coming around. I see Ben there. So.
Thank you, Michael. Really stimulating talk. I have a couple of questions and a comment. What if your talk was titled "The Persistence of Wretched Methods," or "The Persistence of Wretched Motives for Doing Science," or "The Persistence of Wretched Goals in Doing Science"? Would it change the story significantly? And why did you choose subjects as the thing to focus on? And then just a comment about dealing with the stacking. Mm-hmm. If science is organized skepticism, isn't the ultimate frisson or the ultimate forbidden fruit to be skeptical of the skeptics? And therefore, the thing that keeps science going is the sense of having dismantled the orthodoxy.
So both great points. The first one, I think in some cases, it would be the same talk, but I don't think wretched motives would be. One of the things in the cases on the fringe I've worked on, I focus on cases where I think the motives are basically sincere. It's the same motive. That is, the people think they're exploring nature. There is an argument about whether Lysenko falls in this camp or not, but many of the others, the people who think Loch Ness is real aren't, for the most part, hucksters. They're people who really think that there's a plesiosaur living in Loch Ness. And that's what scientists think too. They genuinely believe in what they're doing. So I think there is symmetry and continuity across many of those actions. But with motives, I wouldn't want to call the motives wretched, because that does imply a sort of cynical or maybe pecuniary motivation, which I think does exist on the fringe. It's what a lot of things called quackery in medicine are, but I think that that's a separate epistemic debate. But I think it could be many different things. The reasons why I wanted to focus on subjects is I think that the bodies of knowledge that are created on the fringe are in themselves quite intricate and interesting and should be thought of as subjects worthy of study. So that's why I call it that. But I would be amenable to changing it into different ways. It's also a reference to that book review, which is part of the reason for it. Now, in terms of the stacking and organized skepticism, I think that's absolutely part of what's going on. It's a major motivation for many scientists that they are fighting the orthodox. You can see this in Einstein's letters from 1905, the thrill that he is dismantling the basics of what people thought what came to be called classical physics is visible. That's the same motivation and the same thrill you see in Velikovsky, even though we treat those cases very, very differently. So yes, it is, the skepticism of the establishment is an intrinsic part of it. It's just that we don't usually think of the fringe and science as both engaging in that same enterprise in that same way. So I would absolutely agree with the intuition you have there and say that is a more productive way of treating the fringe with a certain degree of respect for what they think they're doing, and understanding that unless you solve the demarcation problem, you can't possibly talk about the organized skepticism of science without the somewhat less organized skepticism of the fringe. Although the fringe is now quite highly organized. There's still individual lone people here and there, but there's much more communication and collaboration. So thank you for both points. I'll try to be less long-winded as time goes on.
Yes, about, is my mic on?
I don't know if it's on.
About skepticism and symmetry and the question of falsifiability.
I think it's on. It's got a green light. I just don't think it's
falsifiability versus replicability.
Mm-hmm.
Replicability is the gold standard of science today, especially biological science. And if falsifiability is still a viable concept, what do you consider would be the relationship between the two of them? And the fact that there's so much of research today in the biological sciences that is not replicated. How do we approach that reality? Is it with faith or with what? Knowledge?
It's a great question. A different version of this talk would have talked about the replication crisis in biomedicine and behavioral science, which is a serious concern. I'll get to that in a second. About the first point about replicability, certain sciences are replicable and other sciences are not. Big Bang theories are very hard to replicate. We only have one of those. So what you have are theories that try to explain the present based on observational data and inferring back to another point. But replication is not quite how they're organized. That doesn't mean they're not scientific. It just means that science has different standards for how it evaluates what a credible knowledge claim is. And science is incredibly heterogeneous about the kinds of explanations it has. The models of particular lab-based sciences that isolate a particular gene and figure out what protein it codes is a very good model for science, but it's not generalizable to all the sciences that exist. In terms of the replication crisis, I think the replication crisis is very troubling for those who think that the model of how science is done adheres to a certain textbook definition, because it seems problematic that many studies that made it through the peer review process don't seem to be replicable. That tells you something about the peer review process, which is that it's not actually a very good mechanism for determining truth. It is a very good mechanism for a community to recognize its norms and what it thinks are plausible knowledge claims and organize those. But that doesn't mean it determines that the thing that emerges from it is true or not true. For example, peer review is very bad at catching fraud. It just isn't set up to do that. What I think the median citation rate this might make the humanists feel better. The median citation rate for an article in biomedicine is 0. There's so much published that most articles are cited 0 times. So don't worry about your excellent study of philology in the 13th century. It's doing okay. It's got one book review. There's so much published that the system isn't designed for that. So there is, I think, there is quite clearly an active conversation going on in the scientific community about how the publication system and how the scale of science can adapt to the enormous production rate and the enormous diversity of knowledge claims that are made. We're nowhere near a solution to that, even a temporary stopgap solution, but that conversation is ongoing, and it's a very important thing to keep in mind. Someone once asked me recently, like, why am I paying attention to fringe science when science of all areas is doing very well? And I'm like, well, there's the fraud thing, and then there's the replication crisis, and there's actually a lot of issues going on at present. And I think the fringe stuff is adjacent to those questions, but it illuminates each other to see what the social factors around our publication system are that generate things that we don't like about how science is organized now, but we can't quite see how to organize our way around them. So I hope that helps. I don't expect I'm going to persuade anybody here in particular, so I'm happy if there's skepticism. Yeah.
Working?
Now it is.
Okay. This ties in a little bit with the previous question about wretched methods. Do you have any thoughts about current areas of research that are generally regarded as valid science, but which some people hold to, in fact, be pseudoscience because of the lack of proper scientific methods being employed and perhaps will in future be viewed as pseudoscience?
So the short answer to your question is no, because I, as a matter of policy, do not. I get a fair number of questions where people write me and say, is this thing a pseudoscience or not? And I'm not in the business of labeling things pseudoscience. I would actually like that word to go away because I don't think it describes much in the world analytically. I'm not, the people who decide whether something is a pseudoscience or not or deploy the term is basically the consensus of scientists who are like, this is beyond the pale. This thing is not, they're not playing the game right. I'm not that. So I'm not in the business of doing that. I do think it's very interesting when a group of scientists agree, or at least decide, not to say that this theory is wrong, which there's plenty of, but to say that this theory is pseudoscientific. It's an escalation of the rhetoric to a very high pitch. And that happens because of certain social and political circumstances which make that. So that's interesting to me as a historian. But on the merits, I'm not going to go around and say dark energy this or like epigenetics this. It's just not what I do. I'm sure you can wander around the science halls here and you'll find lots of people with lots of opinions, though. So.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for this, Michael. I was interested to note that your talk, you didn't talk about esoterica. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that in particular when you were talking about sort of what happens in the 1970s. And what I was thinking about was how, for example, you have figures that are very much establishment, like, say, Jung, mm-hmm. right, getting involved in Esalen, mm-hmm. right, in California, for example, and becoming part of the sort of counterculture and really kind of getting involved in sort of esoterica and certain of the subjects. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you think the interest in and the sort of study of subjects that we might consider astrology adjacent, but like ghosts or kind of things like that, like might sort of figure into this as well?
It's a great question. I think they figure in very prominently in that those borders are all blurry, right? So psychokinesis is a very well-established area of parapsychology. Parapsychology has its own journals. The Parapsychological Association is part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Psychokinesis, there's micro and macro. There was a lab at my university for 30 years studying micro psychokinesis, like can you influence random number generators with your mind. Macro psychokinesis is called poltergeists. That's what that is. And so ghosts, poltergeists, all that stuff, there's in the same journals. Same discussion. There are bad ways to study ghosts and good ways to study ghosts. Something very similar happens. I'm just going to steal David Kaiser's argument from when the hippies saved physics, because it's a good one. In the 70s, the job market crashes in physics in the early 70s. You have a bunch of highly trained theoretical physicists who have a lot of time on their hands and not much to do and some access to weed. And so they spend a lot of time talking, reading new things. There's a lot of this esoterica floating around. And they get really interested in the questions of the fundamentals of quantum mechanics, which had been a highly marginalized field since the 30s. No one's debating the philosophy of quantum mechanics. They're using it to make lasers and to talk about things. But they have time on their hands and they have these ideas and they meet people at parties who have lots of other things. And so that's when you start getting Fritjof Capra and the Tao of physics and lots of these other ideas. But what the effect of that community raising this topic up again, even though it emerges out of a particular Berkeley environment and a particular access to countercultural thought, is to elevate this topic of the foundations of quantum mechanics to an important research area again. Because it had been marginalized and now it's back, and it's back through the back door. That ends up leading to, I believe, the 2023 or 2023 Nobel Prize in Physics is the attempts to finally prove whether entanglement is real or not. So the esoteric stuff is there. The fringe engages because people are interested in ideas, and at certain moments of crisis or opportunity, you encounter something and you're willing to tolerate it for a little bit. And when everything is going fine and you have your job and you're working within what Kuhn would call your standard paradigm doing normal science, there's no reason to entertain that stuff. When things get a little weird and you're puzzled, you're willing to expand your ideas. And sometimes it goes one way and sometimes it goes another way. Sometimes there's a Nobel Prize and other times you get marginalized from the community. And so I think there's definitely a way esoterica is part of this. I haven't done that much digging in it, but it's clear that Wolfgang Pauli, who's one of the people who's actually very interested in the foundations of quantum mechanics, was also in analysis with Jung talking about exactly this kind of stuff. So there are ways in which those boundaries crossed many times. Jung also is responsible, if you talk to historians of alchemy, for completely screwing up the history of alchemy for like a generation, but they think they've got it back on track now. So.
Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. My question has two parts,
okay.
But they're interrelated. And the sort of basic substance of the question is, to what extent are the discourses of wretched subjects historically and culturally contingent? And what I mean there is many of the examples you offered today, particularly regarding 20th century wretched subjects, were based in a United States context. But you also mentioned Lysenko. I'm also thinking about sort of cryogenic experiments that are happening in the Russian Federation today, among other places. But knowing that you're also a specialist in Russia, the Soviet Union, if you could say a few words about how there might be some sort of intercultural exchange happening with the development of these types of wretched subjects, if at all. And then also, are these developing from historically contingent moments? You know, I'm thinking about this example of the person who is from Philadelphia, moved to Minnesota, is sort of writing these things, or at least developing these ideas in the throes of the American Civil War. Lysenko, of course, is coming off the back of the revolution and the rise of Stalinism. Velikovsky writing in sort of emergence of Cold War culture in the United States. So to what extent are these kinds of frames of knowledge dependent on particular historical conditions?
This is a question that's puzzled me for a long time. So I think there's a fundamental problem I have in which I don't know whether the rate of fringe theory production is constant or variable. Many people today would say there's a lot more of it now than there used to be. Maybe, but we don't know. So 60 years ago, Uncle Leonard had a theory about gravity not existing and so on, and he had green crayon and he wrote his notebooks full, and then when he died, your mom threw away those papers. They're just gone. We just don't have a lot of record of fringe from the past because this stuff is marginalized, so we don't really know, except for certain cases like creationism, where churches kept documents. or Velikovsky, where he kept everything, and he happened to live in Princeton, and they took his archive. So didn't take it; they were given it. But so we don't actually know what the normal rate of production of these things are. But there's always some kind of fringe everywhere we look. We just don't always know that much about it. What's true now is that the communication level of the fringe is much easier. So one guy with notebooks in his basement is one guy with notebooks in his basement, but now he can post them online. And so there's a much greater communicability. We probably have a much better sense now of what the fringe is at this moment, but we have no idea of knowing whether past fringes were more or less per capita. That's just one point about that. So I don't know whether fringes increase over time. It's certainly true that in certain cultures, some fringes do better or worse. Parapsychology, also very popular, especially in the late Soviet Union. UFO theories, there are some, especially in the late Soviet Union, but not in the 50s, which is when you have a lot of it in the US. Different times, different places. There's less of the Bigfoot type stuff and much of that in the US. So different places have more. There is a kind of ape man Maoist thing that has a deep Chinese tradition associated with it. So some places do more and some do less. Astrology is more rooted in some cultures than in other ones. But you have a heterogeneity, and some things are more popular or less. What I do think is very historically contingent is when that pseudoscience label gets thrown out. So many cases, fringe things exist, and people are just like, that's just something those people believe, it's fine. Or it's not fine, but whatever, it's them, I'm not going to get upset about it. In the early 1950s, American scientists throw the word pseudoscience around a very great deal, like a lot. Lysenko is part of that. Velikovsky is part of that. There's parapsychology, there's a bunch of, and so that term has spikes. There's a structure to when that term gets used. And generally, when scientists feel, this is my hypothesis of how to explain this, when scientists feel they're threatened, the term pseudoscience gets used more. When scientists feel like they're unthreatened, they just say that's wrong or they just ignore it. So you won't be surprised to realize the last 5 years, the term pseudoscience is used a great deal. And I think that you can see that structure in various moments. The term illegitimate, which would be the Russian, it's almost never used in Russia, because the scientists during the Soviet period don't feel themselves especially threatened. Even in the case of Lysenko, most of the other science is lavishly funded, very well treated, highly respected. So it's at certain moments that you start to see that kind of label being used. So the people who start calling relativity a pseudoscience tended in the 20s to be strongly anti-Semitic, but also felt that the physics that they loved was dying because of these theories, and so that the threat raises its head. So I think the perception of the scientific community of its degree of safety and threat over time is historically contingent and dependent on different areas, and the pseudoscience term tracks with that. But I don't think that's the same as saying the fringe tracks with that. I think the fringe is a separate phenomenon that gets labeled that at different times. So that's a long-winded way of trying to answer a very good question. Okay.
Thank you very much for your engaging talk. My question is that, in your opinion, what has given modern science the power to relegate so many systems of knowledge into the fringe? And I think the answer to these questions also can help us to this question of boundaries, that is only boundaries that separate science from pseudoscience. Yeah, this is my question. Thank you.
I think the answer to that, the reason why science has the power to do that is because science has cultural authority and prestige, right? Like over most of Western history, religion has that power. And the term heresy is used a lot. And quite a few people die because of things being relegated to the heretical or the heterodox. So at a certain moment, science becomes a very important marker of economic power, cultural prestige, reliable knowledge, all sorts of things come with it. And that's the cultural recognition that is true is what gives it the power to demarcate with some force. As we saw with Hippocrates, he demarcated he tried to demarcate, but he wasn't able to stop those other people. He was arguing from a minority position and from a position of a medical marketplace that was extremely robust and varied. when you have more at stake and more authority, you're able to do more things with preserving your boundaries. So I think that's what gives. The question of why does contemporary science have such high prestige is a very, very big question that I'm not going to attempt to answer here, but I think I'm safe to say that the answer to that is multi-causal and multidimensional. But that's what I think enables that phenomenon to happen, and I think the history of religion is helpful to see what enabled that in different contexts at different times.
Hi. Could you go back to the slide where you had the Orthodox consensus in the middle and the fringe around the edges?
The thing with the circles. Boom, that one. This one?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So what would this diagram look like from the perspective of one of the fringe sciences?
They know they're not in magenta. So they know that. But they don't think they're all out on the edge. So some of them, like most of the people on the fringe, think that they're almost breaking in to that circle, but they know they're not in it yet. So the creationists would think that they are closer. They're not all the way out there with the cosmic catastrophists. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm reminded of what you were saying about how there's this stacking in the fringes where you believe in one and then you see the sky doesn't fall and then you believe in another. And that makes it seem sort of like a gateway drug situation.
Yeah, it's a bit like that.
But isn't there also some element of the relationship to the Orthodox consensus that influences it, where it's not just like, oh, I might as well now look into this UFOs thing. It's like, I don't believe in vaccines, which means the government is lying, therefore they must be lying about other things. So isn't there some sort of hostile relationship to the Orthodox consensus?
In some cases.
It is paralleled also in the hostile relationship of the Orthodox consensus to the fringe?
This is a very astute point. Some of them have that hostile relationship. So there's a certain subset that taxonomy can be extended. There are a certain subset whose basic knowledge claim is a conspiracy theory about the Orthodox consensus. So anti-vax, ufology, and also flat Earth, which basically thinks there's a massive conspiracy to make people think there are globes. You cannot be a flat earther and also believe in UFOs. Those don't work. So it's not the case that you can have just the conspiracy theoretic ones glomming together, because there are inconsistencies between them. There was a guy who thought that Velikovskianism and creationism worked together, and he got purged out of the Velikovsky circle because Velikovsky saw his theory as intrinsically Old Testament, and this other stuff just didn't work for him. Even though they look quite similar. They're both about how do you read the Bible literally and create sciences. So sometimes it does work that way, but it is the case that different people think, the ufologists think they're very close to the Orthodox consensus, but they think the flat earthers are really far away. And so I think that the way this would look differently is in that white area in between, the perspective of different fringes would place themselves in different places. There are some fringe theories that think of themselves as very much on the fringe. They think they're really, really far out. In general, the cryptozoologists think they're very close, because all that's needed to prove one of those theories right is for someone to find one instance of the animal they think exists. And with the giant squid, that happened, right? So that stops being a weird fringe theory and starts being like magenta. So I hope this is getting at some of what you're thinking of, but there is I think that sometimes you get these thematically linked stacking that makes logical sense, but sometimes the JFK and the Shakespeare stuff are just motivated by skepticism towards a central one, but so are many others. And why did you pick that one? Is unclear. It's unclear to me why those stack together, but they did. And I think there's usually a contingent historical explanation for each one rather than a logical philosophical intertwining for most cases. But I'm amenable to discussion about this. I'm not sure whether I'm right. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
So It's probably a two-part question or two different.
You're now off again. Hang on.
Hello?
Yeah, now you work.
Okay, so the way I understand it, and this goes back to the comment about like other cultures and knowledge, I see that science and like math and things of that nature is just an attempt to understand knowledge and truth, right? Where do people go, or where does humanity go when what we're trying to learn about does not fall under what humans are currently
Yeah.
to design an experiment for, right? So I keep thinking about like if humans were sharks, like the sharks who could sense electricity and stuff like that, before humans discovered, if that, like before humans discovered electricity, we would think that that is crazy, that is taboo, that is whatever, 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 right? And so I guess my question would be, in the realm of where there are things that we think exist but are current, we're limited by the science of our time, where do those people go to investigate? Because from what I'm seeing, it'll just get the label of pseudoscience.
Sometimes they do, and sometimes they keep trying to come up with methods that would actually help them get at the thing. There is a school of thought in the philosophy of mind that thinks that what's called, and this is, I didn't make this up, the hard problem, which is how do you get a whole bunch of wet, sloppy cells in your skull to produce mind? How does that happen? There are people who think that our minds are not capable of understanding the answer to that question, that we are cognitively limited and unable to think our way to the answer to that. So there's a limit to where science can go with that question because we are limited by our capacities, period. But it is the case that a classic example of exactly what you're thinking of is there was a long-standing myth that rocks fell from the sky. Very common peasant thought for millennia. Obviously complete nonsense because rocks don't fall from the sky. Until the late 18th century when people actually start investigating and they find meteorites and they're like, oh, look, rocks fell from the sky. The peasants have been telling us this for all this time. So there are moments where people change their perspective and are willing to entertain ideas they did not think before. Sometimes it's because of a change of perspective, and sometimes it's because a new method or a new technique, something like electricity, is discovered, or it's able to be harnessed in the form of the battery, and then you can study its properties in a certain way that opens up other things. But before then, you could end up very easily being classified as fringe. And that happens, and it probably is happening today too. It's one of the reasons why I find the demonization of people who have heterodox ideas not always helpful, because it shuts down some things that we might actually really want to entertain for a little longer. Thank you. Thank you all very much.